How's it going, everyone? This is another Security Unfiltered episode. So, today's episode is with Trey Guinn from Cloudflare. Cloudflare actually decided to sponsor the podcast because they believe in what Security Unfiltered is doing. They like how we present, the information and whatnot. And Cloudflare is a very well known, WAF solution that is used by thousands of companies worldwide. And, we had some common synergies, right? So, they wanted to sponsor the episode, but that doesn't mean that they directed the questions that I'm asking or the conversation that we're having or anything like that. That's absolutely not the case. They just sponsored the episode because they believe in what we're doing here. So, with that, let's get into the episode. Thanks, everyone. How's it going, Trey? It's really great to finally have you on the podcast. We've been trying to get this thing going for a while now. I actually think I started talking to Cloudflare back in April or May. It was one of those months right after my kid where, it's a complete blur, and there was several times where, I went out to dinner or, I had, a meeting or something. And, they would be like, oh, don't you remember, we had this dinner, we had this thing, right, where we discussed all of this. They're like, I don't know. I mean, that doesn't exist to me, right now.
Oh, well, congratulations. And, in the whirlwind will be over in about 18 years, right?
Yeah, hopefully
Yeah.
18.
Yeah.
So Trey, I start everyone off with telling their background. And the reason why I do that is because there's different sections of my audience, right, that are coming from different backgrounds, and they're trying to figure out, hey, is this something that I can do? Is this something that, is possible for me, right? I get that question so many times, right? I want to get into cybersecurity, but I don't come from an IT background. Is that possible? And so I feel like it's always helpful for my guests to just, give their background, tell us where you came from. Did you study IT in college, or did you go down another rabbit hole?
Yeah, it's a good question. So if I go way back, my first job was building computers in the mall. And not the nice mall, the crappy mall. And, so building 486s, this and the other. And I remember got on the internet at first when it was CompuServe, would do dial up at home. Um, Sort of built my computer there, sort of played around. I remember when they added TCP IP to Windows. So I'm really dating myself. But that was 12, 14 years old, I was kind of a kid. And I think what changed that was when I went to university. Um, I had a job at university, but I was working for the university IT team, which meant just network management. So I got into LANs and stuff there and started to really learn networking. I ended up working full time while I was in college at a small business sort of networking company. So I was an IT guy that built built networks and installed them. So I do everything from plug a mouse in to build a Windows NT network and what have you. Um, and then let's see, after college. I kept essentially working the place I was working at while I was in college, um, and did that for a little bit. And I had this sort of life decision in front of me. I was living in Austin. I was doing this sort of small business IT thing, and it was a small company, just a couple of college age kids, fixing networks for lawyers and what have you. And the owner of that business was like, "Hey, I think I want to go back to school. We could do this employee buyout thing. So if you just stick around for 3 years, we'll give you a third of the business." And I was like, "Oh, wow, that sounds really cool." But I was 24, 23, 4 years old, something like that. And I was like, I'm not sure. I'm living in Austin. And I was like, I'm not sure I want to spend the rest, I don't know if I want to spend the rest of my life here. I haven't lived anywhere else. So it was kind of crazy, but I just said, "Thank you so much, but I'm going to quit now instead." And I sold everything I owned and went to go travel around the world for a year, in quotes. But I sort of ended up in New Zealand accidentally got a real job. Um, and then there was like building sort of like data centers and stuff like that. And I ended up being the guy that just like uh, picked up firewalls and became like the first Fortinet certified administrator in New Zealand because I just thought those things were really cool. But I ended up being this again, this kind of a smallish economy, smaller company. I'm only like a couple hundred people there. Um, and then after that, I'll give you the long story. But then I ended up in New Zealand, and after New Zealand, I ended up in Amsterdam, and I kept doing sort of infrastructure stuff and then enterprise architecture um, at a big multinational. And then from there, I got a job at Cloudflare about 10 years ago as a first solution engineer. So that's a slightly abbreviated version, but still wordy.
Yeah, so Trey, you bring up an interesting time, I guess, in the computer world. When you started, or at least you said that you remember when they added TCP IP to Windows NT, I think it was, right? And do you
It was
feel,
Windows 3 to Windows 3.1. It was like when you actually got a TCP IP stack.
oh, jeez,
Yeah.
wow. So, do you think that, engaging with technology back then allowed you to understand kind of the underlying, workings of it quite a bit more than what people do today? And I bring that up because earlier on in my career, I was essentially a Linux admin, right? And the Linux OS did not have a GUI on it. So it was strictly terminal. And so I ended up learning Linux extremely well as learning, the network stack on the Linux server, learning, the different security, configurations and how everything is configured, right? And that kind of opened my eyes because I was used to, Windows, 98, right? Windows 2000, whatever, Windows 7, that's what it was. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, I was used to that GUI, right? Never played around with the terminal, but as soon as I got into the terminal, it really opened up the rest of like technology to me. I feel. Do you look back on that and think the same thing, or is it a different kind of feeling?
Yeah, that's a good question. What leads us to sort of go deeper down in this career? I think what is incredibly helpful has been for me, and even when I was built a solution engineering team at Cloudflare, what made folks really good at their role was folks that wanted to understand how things worked, right? So you're looking for this sort of sense of curiosity. I'm with you. Like I remember trying to get my first sound card to work in Red Hat 2 or whatever it was. And at the time we had this debate in the dorms about like, is it Linux or Linux? And the demo sound was like, hello, this is Linus Torvalds and I pronounce Linux. And I was like, all right, we're like solved. But it took like 2 days to get a sound card to work. And you learned a lot about interrupts and this and the other. I don't, I'm reticent to say that that is the thing that makes you understand the material better. I think you're either curious and you dive in because you find it genuinely interesting, or it's so bloody hard to use that you're forced to learn how it works. But I think both of
Hmm.
those paths work to get you there. Because I mean, there's a bunch of new stuff now that like I should be digging more into. Yeah. So as always, that'll never stop.
Yeah, that's a really good, I guess, analogy or way of thinking about it, right? Like it has to be so hard that you have to learn it inside and out. I mean, there was a point when I was that Linux admin, right, where I had to learn SE Linux, not because I wanted,
Oh, wow.
I didn't even know what SE Linux was, but on the call,
Yeah.
I had a customer that was like, "Oh, we require SE Linux to run, and whenever we run it on your server, everything breaks." Like, okay, well, that's really weird. Like this thing should just be working, right? Like, and I mean, this was weeks later, like I finally had it all down. But like, if you looked at my OneNote that I was taking notes in, because I took, copious amounts of notes. I took the error that I would run into, the command that I ran to fix it, why that command works, and keep on going through it. And the extensive OneNote that I had at the end turned into the troubleshooting guide for all of SE Linux for the company. And like it
Yeah.
was used by the devs to actually say, oh, this is all the changes we need to make. You know, I never would have learned it as well if I wasn't going through those problems. That's for sure.
Yeah, you're like sort of forced through it. You have to build mental models as you go, and then you sort of your. This is actually it's an interesting way to learn. Like I find tinkering and playing with things is a fantastic way to learn, and trying to make something function in SE Linux is like the ultimate version of that. You're like, I think I had the mental model correct, and you're like, nope, it didn't work. All right, I'm like fine tuning continuously.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, along your path, you said that you were at a company doing, some IT work for law firms, right? And they offered you essentially one third of the company, and you chose to travel. So walk me through that decision, right? And this is a really interesting decision for me personally, and I'll tell you why, right? I remember back when I was, younger, right, earlier on in my career, I had just started to develop this mentality of say yes and figure it out later, right? And so I
Yeah.
think to myself, if I was presented with that, one, I would have taken it, right? But what you did was travel the world and start to experience that. And I have a friend who very recently actually just decided to leave his job and was like, you know what? I'm not happy working here. I'm not happy doing this. I'm literally going to go travel the world. Like I've worked, since college. I want to go do this. And so he did it. And I'm extremely envious of him because I have a 7-month old, right? I can't just up and leave. If I do, I have to take two other people with me, and that's very expensive. It's not like I'm a single 22-year-old anymore, right? Like I have responsibilities.
Anything's possible. Anything's possible. You can travel with a family.
It's not
Just a bit
impossible.
slightly
It's
more.
very difficult.
Yeah,
Very
exactly.
difficult, very inconvenient. So,
Yeah.
just
So
talk me through that decision. What did you weigh? How did it look to you? What were you thinking?
yeah, so it's interesting. I wasn't unhappy. I loved my life. I was having a great time, liked the job, etc. But I guess I was aware of the fact that I was like 24 years old. And here was this option to take sort of an ownership stake in a business. And I said, okay, well, if I do that, like, I remember my thought was I was like, okay, then all I need to do is find a house, a wife, and I'll be ready to die. Like, like my whole life will just be like laid out in front of me. Um, and, and I was just like, I'm not sure. I had this sort of sensation where I was like, I need to see other options before I commit to this one. Um, and then what really helped was within a couple months of that, I mean, actually, right, similar timing, but like within a month or two of that, very sort of fortuitously, I was in Banff, Canada. My mom and I have birthdays close to each other, so sort of a birthday trip. We went up there together, but because I was traveling with my mom, I basically spent whatever time I could trying to find people my age to hang out with. And there was a Irish couple of sort of in their 20s or my age that were working behind the bar. They're bartenders at the place, and they explained to me this concept of holiday working visas. The idea that you can get one, explain the idea of travel, right? Like, because Irish and Australians and stuff like it's a very common thing. Like after university, you go spend a year abroad or you do your overseas experience, whatever you call it. And they're like, oh yeah, we got this visa. It's called travel visa, working holiday visa, and you can travel for a year in a place, and you work a little bit, and this and that. And I was like, oh wait, you mean I don't have to have $100,000 saved up to be able to go travel for a year? And yeah, and I basically, that was September when I met them, and it like opened my eyes to this possibility. And I had left the US by January 1. So like within a couple of months, I wrapped up my entire life and was like, I'm traveling the world. And I think I bought tickets to places that I probably couldn't find on a map. Um, and yeah, it was a good time. And best part too is I'd never traveled by myself before, and that was super super valuable for me.
Hmm. Yeah, the very first trip that I ever took, by myself was actually to Germany for study abroad. It was a 4 or 6 week program, right? And it was 2 weeks. Yeah, 2 weeks after donating my kidney. So I donated my kidney.
Oh my
Told my
goodness.
told my doctor like, hey, I'm not going to make the checkups, in a couple weeks because I'm going to Germany. And so they, had to tell me like what hospital go to if anything went wrong and everything like that. But that experience, really prepared me for the rest of my life up to this point, at least. It was amazing. And it's really interesting to me how well traveled, Europeans are. Like they travel all over Europe all the time. Right. And I was talking to someone from Russia and he said, oh, how many countries have you been to? Right. And I'm like, two. This is number two, been to America if you count that. Right. And he goes, oh, well, how much of America have you traveled? I'm like, not that much. Like I had enough states to, maybe fill a hand if I was being generous. Right. And he was very confused as to how lacking in the traveling department I was. And I had to explain to him, if you pull up a map, right, we have 50 states over here, right? You pull up a map and you look at one of our states and it's, the size of potentially a couple small European countries, like,
Yeah.
like Illinois, right? You could drive in one direction for 8, 10 hours. If you start at the very top, you go all the way to the bottom, that's 10 hours and you just made it through one state, you know? And he, like him wrapping his mind around that was, was really interesting because I was also trying to wrap my mind around them being so traveled because they were like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to Australia, I'm doing this," and I'm over here. I'm like, man, I'm just lucky I made it here.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's I highly recommend folks, whether it's travel or in any way, just trying to expose yourself to other ways of thinking and other ways to approach problems, and uh, just get people to challenge the things that you have assumed that you've sort of been socialized to grow up with. And you may still agree with those, but like from that very beginning decision, like just because this is the default, is this the thing you really want to stick with? And we can bring that right back to tech. I mean, that's also the way you like figure out how things work is like, can you run with the defaults or do you really need to understand like the implications of changing something? Yeah.
Hmm. Now, did you experience a lot of that in your tech jobs overseas, where they were going about a problem differently from how you would have addressed it, and what was that situation something that you went through, or
Yeah.
maybe not,
Actually,
right? Because tech is
no,
universal
no. I,
almost.
well, yes and no. Actually, I learned a ton. I lived in Amsterdam for about almost 6 years. And one of the jobs I had there was I was a enterprise architect for KPMG, but like KPMG
Huh.
internal IT, like the KPMG business, not facing customers. Um, and we had a enterprise architecture team that was sort of largely split between Amsterdam and New Jersey. And what I learned there was just this cultural way of going about solving problems. Um, and this is sort of slightly exaggeration, sort of slight hyperbole, but if you came up with a problem set, a set of requirements, and you brought it to the Dutch team, which I was sort of on the Dutch team, right? They would spend they'd spend a month coming up with this like perfect self-healing,
Hmm.
every potential solution sort of considered, every possibility. Like they really thought things through. They're very very long-term focused. They always think things like you know 100 years, like when they build houses in their neighborhoods, they're thinking like 500 years out. Like we barely think 6 months out. And and so they just have this very long term perspective. But it would take like a month to come up with like a design for the system, much less then you have to go build it. You'd hand the same problem set to the Americans, the American team, and the American team would like have a POC running by Friday. And like it'd be up and running. Now you would have to duct tape it like to no end. Like it's gonna cost a fortune. Like they hadn't considered any of the problems that could arise. I hadn't really thought through anything, but it was running. And what my takeaway was is that like the ideal is somewhere in the middle. Like you have to move fast to like take advantage of market opportunities and just like as opportunities come up. But you also need to somehow balance sort of like the short termism versus long termism. And what I really liked was being exposed to both of those teams and seeing how they functioned. Because I felt like I could learn from both. So
Hmm.
the question was like is spot on, but that was super like formative for me in my career.
Yeah, at my current employer, right? They're a German company, and it's just it's insane how much they actually think through this stuff and everything. I just spent a year doing what they call a POC, right? And to
Yeah,
me, the POC was only the past 6 weeks, right? It was the only time that I was actually like doing hands on keyboard, actually getting into the weeds of different things. And I've been working on it for the past year, right? Because
yeah,
they want every single, T crossed, every I dotted. They want to think about it a couple times. And I learned in that process that, when they're designing vehicles over in Germany, they will they'll have button requirements where corporate will say it cannot have more than X amount of buttons in the vehicle. Where you place
yeah.
them is up to you, and they will debate this. I guess they were actually debating this for like 8 months, all the way up until the car was actually released. And corporate had to put a boundary on these engineers saying, okay, you have 2 months to make this decision because we have to figure out everything else. We can't be held up because you don't know where to put a button. Like, you need to figure it out. Um, which is really interesting because I drive a German sports car, right? And my wife has the same manufacturer, right? I'm trying not to give away too much information because
Yeah,
as
yeah,
soon as I do, right, everyone's going to be like, "Oh, this is where Joe works," right? That's what I
yeah,
want to
yeah,
avoid. So my wife also drives an SUV from the same car manufacturer. And if I sit in her car and I sit in my car, one, they're two totally different cars. They perform totally differently, but they are the exact same experience in terms of the
mm,
cockpit experience. The buttons are in the exact same place. It feels the same. There's very few differences, and they do that very intentionally because they want it to be, if you drive our lowest end car or our highest end car, it's the same controls, it's the same functions. It performs differently, but it's mostly the same, all around. It's really fascinating to me of how much how much time they will put into making the decision not right but perfect.
yeah. It's that idea of designing systems with a user experience that people can just appreciate and they can like sort of jump in and use. And then obviously with ideally you don't want to have to require to read. You don't want someone to be required to read the owner's manual to figure out how to turn the air conditioner on. It should just be
Right.
obvious, right? It should be intuitive. And this probably goes to I was going to bring it around to like security again. Like it's shocking when you think about sort of solutions that are not secure by design, or it's like not intuitive. Like I always feel like hard to use systems are inherently less secure and hard to use also for end users. Like if security adds too much friction, people will find a way around it. Like they won't leverage it. And so it's like, how do you really think about that end user experience, making it consistent, making it just where you don't even have to think. It should just be intuitive. You're like, oh, I want to put the car in drive. It's like it's super obvious what I'm doing, and I'm doing the right thing. I'm not accidentally putting the emergency brake on in the process. You know.
Right. So Trey, you mentioned you started off as, what was it, a solutions architect at Cloudflare. Is that right?
Yeah, so I was the first solution engineer at Cloudflare. technically I was the first hire in the sort of customer facing sales team. And I'd never been in a, quote unquote sales team. I would like really cringe at that moniker. But it ended up being like my favorite job, which because I had all this background in sort of being, I was an SRE before. I was like IT guy. I built data centers. I like working with customers. I really like solving their problems and understanding what they're trying to accomplish. And then I feel like it's like designing like a Lego setup, right? Like I love hearing like what the requirements are, looking at what the tools are, and like trying to come up with the best solution to meet the requirements. And also think like the Dutch do, right? Like think a little bit in advance of like, where what's going to be step 2 and step 3 after this, and how can I like sort of prep you for that? Turns out I didn't realize that's what solution engineering is. Sort of like figuring out how to like solve someone's requirements. And so ended up being a sweet gig. And I was the first solution engineer, and then I ended up managing and building that team up to, I did that for 8 years. So ended up being a global team of 160 people. And so I had solution engineers in, I don't know, like 20 different countries, and just this amazing group of people. And yeah, so that's how I started at Cloudflare.
Wow. That is a really interesting start, because now you're a field CTO, which I mean it's I guess this is the best way of putting it, right? It's obviously a higher level position, but it's like it's almost completely different because it's a different set of problems that you're trying to resolve. You may not be in the weeds every day, like you alluded to previously. You're not in the weeds every day, and so it's more difficult for you to stay on top of all the different evolving technologies and whatnot, right? And so, how do you find the time even to stay on top of it? Do you have key resources that you go to that maybe give you a quick blurb about something, right, that you may need to know for a customer meeting or something like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one, Um, it is challenging because I'm obviously like, even just with our own products and solutions, I'm just like, I'm not getting my hands dirty with it nearly as much now. I'm sort of, in a way, I'm like sort of more focused on the strategy versus the practicality of what you're doing with it. Um, but I think what has served me well is just to try to maintain that sense of curiosity. I'm, and what is saves my bacon is, I mean, one, I'm lucky to work at a company that blogs super extensively about how things work in the background and what have you. And I find that super interesting. I'll read about, you know, how different Cypher suites function, and, super low level kernel things in the Linux kernel, which to be honest is like way past anywhere I've ever actually played around with. But just it helps sort of build those mental models. And then critically, I'm lucky is that Cloudflare as a place is really transparent internally, and everyone's really helpful and friendly. So if I find myself curious, I like try to, when we worked in the office, I would literally tap someone on the shoulder. Now it's the sort of virtual tap on the shoulder. I'm like, hey, do you mind taking 10 minutes explaining to me how this works? Because
Hmm.
I'm just trying to like have that model in my head. And so working with product or engineering, I do that a lot, and hopefully taking those ideas when we're working with customers, partners, sort of government entities, etc. And largely, it's not even so much trying to convince them to do one thing or another. I just like it's largely trying to just essentially educate what I'm learning from these smart engineers at Cloudflare. Like if I can just sort of pass that information along, then these folks can make a more informed decision about what their next steps are.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. When you're talking to different customers, is there a common issue or a common thread with your customers that you're seeing? It might be consolidating their tech stack, right? Because over time, the tech stack has grown so significantly. It's difficult for even the engineers to keep up with, right? And, for example, just recently, I was faced with an issue that I was trying to solve without a tool that we had bought, deployed, and were running that specifically solves this problem, right? And I had no clue that it had that capability. I knew that we had it, but I didn't know that it had that capability, right? And I'm someone
Yeah.
who's pretty much in the weeds, like
Yeah, and
I'm in this stuff,
you're on top of this stuff. Yeah, exactly.
right? So like, is that a problem, or is there more unique problems than that?
I mean, we always have those challenges. I mean, uh, particularly for ourselves, like we're an innovative company. We keep shipping new things. I mean, it's hard enough for like our own employees to know what we have this week, much less our customers. And then half the customers have sort of been introduced to Cloudflare at some date in the past, and then when they chat with us today and we're like, oh, this is what the platform does, they're like, whoa, that's like 10x what I thought you guys did. And I think the interesting thing there is that I really think Cloudflare is kind of a new category of business. And we finally actually started like trying to come up with a name for this. And we don't think we're going to be the only one. Like we think there's other companies doing this, but you used to have like um, your WAN company, a firewall company, load balancer company. They had all these different companies that did different things, um, and that worked in a world where lots of compute and applications and users are kind of like were together. Like back when I was building NT networks for lawyers, like it worked because like the lawyer, the server, the application, the data was like kind of all on the LAN, right? But we've seen 10 years of like cloud and SaaS and whatever. So now we're in this world where like things are super, super distributed. You've got users all over the place, applications all over the place, data all over the place. And cloud has worked well for that. Like using cloud environment, I hate saying cloud, it's just basically automation. So automation's worked well for like building like dynamic sort of store and compute. Um, and the internet works really well for making it possible for you to be anywhere. You've got 5G, you've got all these things. But if you're asking that question of like, what's that common problem? Is I think like for some reason, like networking and security has been the laggard, where the way people solve problems back when I was building NT networks, and even like, when I was at, when I lived in New Zealand, we hosted applications. We had our own data center, helped like build a data center and stuff. And we like racks of servers. That model of like, okay, you got an application and you got a user here, and then in between them, you just got to put these functions. And you normally do those functions with like VMs or boxes or something like that. And you have to choose where they run. Like that sounds very common, right? Um, they're like we're trying to use that model in this world where now the application, the user are everywhere. And so you're like, oh, so I guess we just need more of those boxes. And that doesn't work well. Like I talked to a big European bank that runs like 75,000 firewalls in their internal network. And so like I talked to another bank in New York that was saying the other thing, this is like classic thing was we have this cloud's great. We can spin up a developer environment in 30 seconds, but then it takes like 6 weeks to get them access to it because the change tickets to go through the 12 control layers and the four
Jeez.
proxies and da da da. So that to me is like the common problem in our industry today is that like networking and security has like been this laggard. And I think of, and when I not security broadly, but like sort of security that you do in the network, and because the network is like such a point of visibility for that, um, that has been this laggard, and we need a new model. And I think this new model is like we're calling it connectivity cloud. I mean, that's what the marketing people come up with, but it's not terrible. But the idea being that you can have a more ubiquitous set of controls so that you can have the same controls and they can be in all these places in a orchestrated way. I think that is this challenge that a lot of folks are running into. And you talk about complexity, where they've like over the last 10 years, like they added a bunch of cloud environments, added SaaS, they did all these things, and now like you try to like make a change, like get a developer access to their development environment, and it takes 6 weeks. Like that's crazy. Like things have gotten so complex. Like got to find a way to make it simpler, and consolidating the number of vendors too is a big part of that too. But like, and then going to DevOps and DevSecOps and all that stuff and automating it is really important. But I think like the fundamental problem is that like we took the network stack from 25 years ago and we just tried to like copy paste it out to like every environment we have a data server or a server or a chunk of data in now, and that doesn't work well.
That's
So, sorry, that was a
insane.
long-winded thing, but that's literally like the thing I've been working on for 10 years at Cloudflare.
Yeah, I mean it's crazy how complex these environments can be. I'm sure if that bank ever leaves that firewall vendor, they'll be their stock will really take a hit that day. You know?
There's some sales guy on a yacht somewhere who's loving life because of that deal, but yeah, whatever. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
his
like it
own private island.
doesn't serve the doesn't serve the bank, doesn't serve the bank's customers, and you're like, there's got to be a better way to do this.
Yeah, that's so insane. It's been tempting at times to go over to the sales route, but I just
The
don't want to
dark
do it.
side.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah,
want to do
I
it.
don't blame you. No, actually, yeah, I wouldn't push anyone in that direction. I always just thought when I was building the solution engineering team, my whole thing was you could find um, salespeople that were marginally technical, or you could find engineers that like to talk to people. And my whole strategy was like I wanted to hire engineers that just like to talk to people.
Hmm.
That was and I think it really varies by company and what you're working in and stuff like that. But that was our strategy with the solution engineering team.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense. It's not very common that you find someone so technical, able to, talk to a customer, without having any issues, without stumbling around and not being untalkative and not being too talkative. You got to have a certain level of communication skills, I guess, to be able to be successful at that role.
Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting role, and to be honest, it's even I stopped leading that team 2 years ago, and it's even more mature now. Like they have more sophisticated leaders who have done this more. So it's not only being really structured and thinking about how you not only do you have to have like sort of good EQ and be able to communicate, but um, having a sort of structured a way of like trying to extract out what's important to the customer. What are they trying to solve for? Um, 10 different ways to ask the same question, because, you know, you will know this, and every engineer knows this, which is people tend to come to you and say, do X. And instead of just saying yes, you should probably ask, what are you trying to accomplish? Like, because what you've come to me with like an implementation, and you've come to the expert and told the expert just do this implementation. Like probably you should come to the expert with is I'm trying to accomplish this outcome. Like what do you recommend as a way to do that? And like that's a much healthier way, but try to do that in a like a non-combative way. We're like, oh, okay, you want X, but like, tell me why you want X. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish? And then when they say something, you're like, oh, okay, well, we could do X, but there's this other thing we could do, and it has sort of these benefits. Like, what do you think of that? And they're, oh, wow, that's great. You guys are helpful. It's that sort of conversation repeated 5 billion times.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, I guess in security and even, more of the general public, I guess every, maybe let's call it once a quarter, right? We see Cloudflare in the news in a good way, right? For once, we see a security company in the news for something good, right? And it's always Cloudflare stopped, X attack, right? Or X DDoS attack. That's the new largest DDoS attack ever. One, how are these attacks measured, right? Because I'm seeing, was it 398, 400 million requests per second, which is pretty insane. That's hard for me to picture even what that is, what that looks like. And two, how in the world is Cloudflare able to do that? Right? Because I feel like no one else in the world can do that. I mean, it's numbers that are hard to imagine, right? So how's that even possible?
Well, it kind of goes back to that point I was making about like building things in this like very distributed way. For the engineers in the audience, you'll appreciate this that Cloudflare was the first company to really build a big Anycast network, a sort of reverse proxy. And so about 20% of all domain names on the internet today are behind Cloudflare.
Hmm.
So we're already running at a big scale. And then you think about like how, if you don't mind me getting technical for a second, but if you think about like how you would interact with a website or like a web application or an API from your phone, etc. First thing is you look up a DNS record, you get an IP address, you connect to that IP, and then you do like a layer 7 request for, or you establish SSL, and then you do HTTP generally. Um, but traditionally, when you look up an IP address, there's like your phone number on the internet, right? It would exist in one place. And this was the big problem with DDoS back in the day was because you had like one address to attack, you could the first D in DDoS is distributed and you could build a botnet that's all over the place and it could concentrate an attack in one place and just knock it over. And
Hmm.
it's sort of like the law of averages here. Like one person can never fight off, right? Like I don't care how badass you are. Like if enough people come at you, and you're just one, like there's nothing you can do about it. And so what the even the founders of Cloudflare actually from the very beginning did this. When we have IP addresses on the internet, we advertise them from all of our data centers at the same time. So that's like 300 different data centers now. So what is weird is that that IP will be out in a data center. The same IP will be a data center in Dallas and one in Moscow and one in Auckland, New Zealand, and Sydney, Australia, and wherever else. And so when you've got this distributed botnet that's launching an attack and it tries to attack that IP address, it actually ends up hitting the closest one, and that sort of um, load balances an attack out in that way. And as you mentioned, like we just on Tuesday had a big announcement where we basically did a responsible disclosure of this new crazy 0-day vulnerability in the HTTP protocol that is leading to just these crazy world record attack types. But luckily, we're able to work together with some industry peers, and the goal really is to try to get everyone patched and sort of on top of this. But I do think that it represents this sort of like step change where we're going to start probably seeing a lot more layer 7 denial of service attacks than we have seen in the past.
Wow, that's really interesting. I've never, I guess I've never thought about it quite like that, where DDoS attacks were very successful because they could focus, this huge like army of devices on a single point. But by eliminating that single point, it doesn't really matter, right? Because yeah, you can take down. Let's say you take down one, right? Well, we have 300 other data centers or
Yeah,
CDNs, right, that are projecting the same thing out there. So good luck
you
taking
just want
all of that down at once.
yeah you want to distribute your defenses just as much as the attack is distributed. So
Hmm.
that's really the trick. Is like you stop a distributed attack with a distributed defense.
Wow, that is. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. It's just,
Yeah.
I can't believe it's. I mean, I don't want to call it simple, but I can't believe it's that simple of a thought behind it, right? Because I just always, I don't know, I didn't think about CDNs in that way of being able to be used to load balance the traffic like that. But it makes complete sense as to why you can do that.
Yeah, I mean, one, I don't mind calling things simple because I think the most brilliant things are simple. They also are some brilliant, simple things are really hard to pull off. um, but I would even say though that this idea of doing Anycast where you're advertising over BGP, the same IPs in different places, is Cloudflare was essentially one of the first companies to do that for stateful protocols like TCP. And historically, um, we hate being called a CDN because we're like, oh, it's like calling a car an ashtray. Like your car has an ashtray in it, but like we have a CDN, but we do a bunch of other things. Um, the but the way that, like, I guess the other players that have been in this market for a lot longer, what they did was they would load balance with DNS. So if you looked up the IP address, do a DNS lookup, you would get a different response depending on where you were. So they did only have single IPs in one place, but they would just give different IPs to different people. And that generally works because that's another way to sort of load balance. But if you, instead of attacking like a domain name, and where you're resolving it and getting different IPs, if you just attacked a single IP, then you could still like load up on it. And by having the IP itself advertised in different places with Anycast, that like it raises it to the next level up. And plus, not to get too much in the details, but with DNS giving different IPs, you run into these like replication challenges, and how long is it going to take for sort of DNS queries to fall out of caches and stuff. I'm sure you've seen this before as well. Anyone that's learned sort of IP config commands, to flush your DNS cache, you know why. So that's that stuff.
Yeah, that is such a headache, especially when you're trying to like deploy a proxy and it has other settings on it. It's not taking the new stuff. It's so
Yeah.
frustrating. It just like it makes the product look a little bit worse to the organization because it's like, oh, this is supposed to be flawless. You sold it as flawless, you know.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
always makes for interesting situations. Those small nuances like that.
But this is where we learn, right? Like when, like we're forced to make something work and you're like, this isn't working. My mental model didn't function. It's like right back to our first conversation, which is like, how do you get yourself in a position where you have to learn how something functions at a very basic level?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, where is Cloudflare going? Because I feel like Cloudflare has been around for a while now, and Cloudflare has always been known as, that DDoS protection, right? That CDN
Yeah, yeah.
almost, right? Where do you see Cloudflare going as a whole? Are you guys working on new offerings that you plan on releasing in the future? Are you stepping into other domains and needs of security? I would imagine that if you do go down that path, you'd actually be pretty successful at it. You'd have a good product. You'd have, provide good quality to the industry because of your track record with what you're doing already. Where are you guys going?
Well, so when I started over 10 years ago, we had some basic protections for web applications, right? And so you think about this as sort of like, and for many years we were just sort of expanding out like what you could do. So whether you're talking about web apps to other things like TCP and UDP, but like basically, how do you shield an application from DDoS? You could do load balancing, rate limiting. Then you start to do like fraud detection, bot management, all this stuff. But from the very beginning, Cloudflare is sort of like a networking and security company. And to like oversimplify, networks connect users to applications. And we were doing that first part, which was protecting applications. And then back in 2020, like sort of like right around the time COVID came out, we started launching a set of services for protecting the users because we are like, oh, okay, we're we're the network. So that's a lot of sort of forward proxy, protected DNS, um, CASB, email phishing protection. Like there's a ton of stuff you can do there, like DLP, etc.
Mm.
So that security side, um, and then we also at a similar time launched more network services. So we can do we can protect sort of site to site. We can replace your WAN, and we can do like firewall there. So IPS, IDS, things sort of in the network itself. And to me, that's really cool because you've got like, okay, wherever the user is, you can get all the protections for the user. Then on Cloudflare, and then the Cloudflare itself can be the network that carries the traffic to wherever it's going. with the network services, and then you protect the application itself with the application stuff. So that's sort of where we are today. And then if the interesting thing, the where we're going, sorry, give me the long answer of this,
Hmm.
is how did we build that well, right? We from the very beginning we had built this idea of running the same things in all these places, etc., in this like natively distributed way. And so to make our own developers productive, and so like we have a developer that'll build like they'll build a new load balancer, they'll build a new deep pack inspection capability. We didn't want them to think about how that like where to run it. Like, do they deploy it to Dallas or Moscow? They just deploy it to the network and it runs everywhere. And that's super compelling. Like it literally runs all over the place. And so there was all this work that went into building this sort of like natively distributed environment. And we finally were like, oh, customers probably want that too. And so that's turned into this whole serverless platform. And I think that's the unknown future. But like if the world starts really developing things in serverless, that becomes like super compelling. And but then we're like competing with like Amazon and Google. So that's if that plays out well and the sort of industry moves the direction we are, that's a big future for us also. So
Hmm.
that's a long answer to your question. All four areas I think have futures, but that's some of them are we've been doing for a while, and other things we're just sort of like ambitiously sort of stretching into.
Yeah, it's really interesting seeing all the different tech trends and where they go and everything like that. And the past couple of years, every company that I've been at, every company that I've even talked to or know people at, they're all going serverless, right? And they're kind of dipping their toes in the water right now with serverless. My current company, they're probably the most serverless that I've seen yet.
Oh,
They
cool.
they go like serverless first. So it's
Nice.
it provides interesting challenges, especially for someone to just learn the serverless side and like kind of wrap your head around that. It's a whole other like game that you're playing that you're trying to figure out. And from a security professional, how do you secure it? How do you make it easy for your developers and everything else? So it opens up a whole other can of worms, I guess, which is really interesting to see Cloudflare go into that, because as this space is kind of evolving and growing and turning into a more mainstream, deployment approach, it's really interesting to see Cloudflare, also identify that and say, oh, you know what, why don't we take this tech and move it into this, but we have to build it from the ground up, for this architecture, because that's the only way that anything runs in this serverless world.
Yeah, yeah. It's just sort of like if we say that everyone's moving from sort of centralized things to very distributed, we're this network that helps like move, connect your user to your application, no matter where the user is, where the application is. But then like the logical, if things get really distributed, the logical like next step is like there are certain things that you don't even want to run in your data center. Like, can you just make them run in the network themselves? And so I think that's what we're starting to see is like there's certain use cases, or even like storing of data. Like we have a like an S3 compatible object storage. And so we're finding like some AI companies are using that to hold their training data, and they can like move, makes it really easy to like take the training data to whatever cloud they're using to build their LLM and that kind of thing. So there's just certain use cases that make sense just to put it in the network itself. And that's exciting when you start thinking about serverless in that way, going, oh, okay. And also from you and I, like thinking about like making something super available and low latency, you're like, oh, okay. Before, if I wanted something to be available, I had to, have a master with a slave and like manage orchestration, etc. And then if I was lucky, I'd have two or three instances. Where if you can like deploy to a serverless environment like Cloudflare, you're like, oh, there's now literally like tens of thousands of or incidents of it running, and I don't have to orchestrate it at all. Like it'll sort of like that's part of the platform. That's really cool.
Hmm. Yeah, it makes for a interesting future, that's for sure. Well, Trey, we're unfortunately at the top of our time here. I feel like I'd go another 2-3 hours with you, but I got to respect everyone's time, especially my own. I'm sure my wife will kill me if I stay on any longer. But before I let you go, why don't you tell my audience where they can find you, where they can find Cloudflare, if they've been living under a rock for somehow, for the past 10 years. And yeah, give them all that good information so they can learn more if they want.
Yeah. Well, one, thank you so much, Joe, and thank you to your wife for lending your time. The this has been a blast. I could chat with you for ages. You can find Cloudflare at cloudflare.com. And actually, where I recommend people start is blog.cloudflare.com. We got a really, really good blog. And if you want to just geek out on some stuff, there's a thing called radar.cloudflare.com. And the radar you can get stats on like IPv6 versus 4 and what kind of DDoS attacks are happening in which countries on which networks. There's some really cool sort of like real-time dashboards of the internet. And if you want to find me, you can find me on LinkedIn. It's probably the best place to get a hold of me. And would love to connect with folks and answer questions. And hopefully you and I will meet in person sometime soon, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be great. Well, thanks, Trey, and I hope everyone listening to this episode enjoyed it. I will have all of the links down in the description of the episode. Make sure you go check them out. Thanks, everyone.